hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and again for your patience. I know it's been a little bit challenging with the start, but we're really excited to have Kelly here. And so my name is Katka Letzing. I'm the director of the IVLP division here in IAE San Francisco, overseeing the IVLP division. And I know Trish wanted to say a few words as well.
Yeah, hi, I'm Trish Tierney. I'm the executive director of the office here, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. And it's great to have some of our sponsors are here from Chevron, Sarah and Dina, and Vic, our board member, is here, and lots of other friends, and new friends and old friends. And so it's always great to have wonderful international visitors here as a reason to gather. And we're excited to hear from Kelly and welcome her. And thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules today.
Beautiful. And so I just wanted to start kind of maybe a little introduction of the program and a little bit more about IVLP. Just for logistics, we are trying to record this event for the purpose that can be shared later on for educational purposes, as well as sharing with local schools with disabled kids who unfortunately could not join us today, but we thought it would be a really great way to share Kelly's experiences with them. So I know it's a brown bag lunch, so just for logistical reasons, I was hoping to ask you if you could eat a little bit later in the presentation so we can control the sound. I will start with statistics that I just learned from my research working on this project. Over a billion people live with some form of disability. This corresponds to about 15% of the world's population. Between 110 to 190 million people have very significant difficulties in functioning. Rates of disability are increasing due to population aging and the global increase in the chronic health and conditions. And so that's why we chose this event today as one of the topics that is really focusing through the IVLP program, which is run through the Department of State, bringing international leaders from all around the world, from more than 170 different countries, and over 1,000 of them to San Francisco on an annual basis. I'm really pleased and honored to introduce you to Kelly Vincent. It's really hard to say her bio because she's so accomplished. I try to. She is the first woman and youngest person elected to the Australian Parliament. And she was elected in 2010 to the Legislative Council of the South Australia, the upper house of South Australia's Parliament. She's also a member of Dignity for Disability, a political party. Her legislative interests include initiating change in Australia's justice system to give people with disabilities an equal voice in court, advocating for appropriate treatment for people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness, and ensuring that each piece of legislation is viewed through a disability lens. Ms. Vincent, for the fun part, is a playwright active in No Strings Attached Theatre of Disability. On this trip, as you may know, on IVLP, the participants usually come to Washington, D.C. and to multiple different cities. In Kelly's case, she had a chance to visit Washington, D.C., New York, New Orleans, Portland, and now is her final stop in San Francisco. We are really honored to work with many different organizations in the Bay Area to schedule different meetings for Kelly. And we were really thrilled when she agreed to talk to us today and sharing her experiences with our public and the community. So I don't want to take any more time. So Kelly, if you would like to take a word, and we're really excited to have you here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katka, and everyone who's put effort into organising not just today, but my entire program. It's been an absolute honour to visit your beautiful country and see all the great work you're doing, especially when it comes to disability rights. As has already been said, my name is Kelly Vincent, and I'm a member of the upper house of the South Australian Parliament, representing Dignity for Disability. And this is a political organisation established in 2003 by a mixture of people with disabilities, but mainly parents of, at that time, young adult children with disabilities. And I suppose those parents were realising that they were running out of time in which they were going to be able to support their children, and looking for better services for those children once their parents and families were no longer able to support them. So that's where we have our roots, and my involvement in the party is a little more recent than that. I joined during the 2010 state election campaign, At that time I was, or recent to that time, I was struggling to get the new wheelchair that I required due to a lack of government funding and a complex eligibility process and the lack of availability of therapists to fit me for that wheelchair and so on. So long story short, I was approved for the funding for the wheelchair in January of 2008, but didn't actually sit in the wheelchair for the first time until October of 2009. So roughly an 18-month wait, which is, as I found out through that experience, was not uncommon. So I started speaking at forums and conferences publicly about that experience and what it had taught me, and you know, why the system needed to change, and what we were losing out as a society by not providing people with adequate disability support. And through doing that, I met Dr. Paul Collier, who ran the party at the time as president of the organisation. He himself lived with quadriplegia following a car accident in the UK at the age of 21. Of course, coming to Australia, he found that a lot of services were not as readily available or advanced as they might be in the UK. So he became very passionate about trying to move the Australian system to be a little more advanced. Very long story short, Dr. Collier unfortunately passed away unexpectedly 9 days out from election day, which meant I went from being the number 2 candidate for the election to number 1 somewhat by default. But it's an incredible number of boxes, an incredible experience to kind of tick by default, being the youngest person ever elected to an Australian Parliament at that time, disabled and female. So it's certainly been an interesting journey, and one that I of course wish came to me in more less tragic circumstances, but one that I have enjoyed every minute of. Some of the work that we've been doing that Katka touched on very briefly includes working to make the justice and police system more accessible to people with disabilities. And this came more or less out of a very high-profile media case which involved 7 children with intellectual disabilities who were allegedly sexually abused by the school bus driver. And because these children were by and large non-verbal or had a very limited verbal capacity, they were seen as unreliable witnesses in a court. So we have been advocating very strongly for the use of what we call intermediaries, which is a person or people who are professionally trained in communicating with people who use alternative communication methods, and to help facilitate that conversation, if you like, between a judge and a witness, or a witness and a police officer. And one of the reasons that we are incredibly passionate about doing this, and there are many of them, but I think one of the key ones is that statistics show that people with disabilities are between 4 and 7 times more likely to experience some form of physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime than their non-disabled peers. And while there's no real proof on this, I think it makes absolute sense that perhaps one of the reasons for that is that people wanting to perpetrate that kind of terrible abuse know that they are more likely to get away with it if people with disabilities are seen as less reliable witnesses in courts and police interviews than their non-disabled peers. So I, in October of 2011, established a parliamentary inquiry into access to the justice system for people with disabilities. We took evidence from real people and their families living with disabilities who had been through a court process or police process and had either had a success story or some kind of barrier that they had faced, or both. And one of the reasons that I was really keen to do that was it's very difficult for people to resist this kind of change once they have the real life stories in front of them that prove that yes, in theory everything is going well, but you know, this is what the real life experience would suggest. That committee recently tabled its report, coming out very strongly in favour of several measures, of course, but 2 key ones being, of course, the use of intermediaries to help facilitate the communication between a judge and a witness, but also to instate a scheme of mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect of certain people with disabilities. And I actually have a bill before Parliament, and have had for several years in some form a bill before Parliament to do just that. My bill particularly focuses on people who intellectually may not actually comprehend that they're being abused or neglected, or physically may really struggle to readily make a complaint about it themselves. Of course, it's a very interesting tightrope that you need to walk when dealing with an issue like this, because you want to protect the people who genuinely require protection without saying, you know, that every time Kelly gets a bruise on her leg or something, you have to call the police. So it's been an interesting issue to work on. Unfortunately, the government's position at this point is they will not support the bill, because their advice is that it is better to safeguard people with disabilities so that they are aware of their rights and can protect themselves against abuse. The interesting point is that I don't ever recall saying it was one or the other. I think I think it's just like, you know, that we teach people not to sexually abuse other people, but it doesn't mean we don't have special sexual investigation branches of police and so on for, you know, for when that unfortunately does happen. So that will be an interesting journey, I think, progressing that bill through the Parliament. But I think now with that committee report, we certainly have even more motivation than previously to do that. Other work that we have been doing on a legislative level also includes introducing legislation to amend our Disability Services Act, which is the act that deals with, and it varies from state to state, who is eligible for services, what those services are, and so on. Attempting to move that with my bill to more of a human rights-based framework, where people, for example, actually have mechanisms to go to if they are not receiving a service to which they are entitled, or they're not receiving it in a timely manner, and so on. The other two things that particular bill seeks to do are actually things that have recently been accomplished without the need for legislation, which is somewhat encouraging. One was the establishment of a community visitor scheme for people with disabilities, which is not dissimilar to your protection agency, I think you call it over here, where people, you know, can visit institutional residencies and similar settings and make assessments as to the level of support that's being delivered there. In South Australia, we've had that for people living with mental illness since 2009, but in 2012 we saw it expanded to include people with all kinds of disabilities, so we think that's very encouraging. And the other measure that my bill sought to do, I just got an email a few days ago saying that the government has conceded to implement this, is a senior practitioner who oversees and approves or denies the use of what we call restrictive practices, so things like physical and chemical restraint against people with disabilities, which unfortunately is very rife, not just in Australia but across the world. I think particularly chemical restraint, it's not uncommon from what we're hearing for a support worker or personal care attendant to say go with a client to the GP and say, their behaviour is escalating and they need a higher dosage of whatever medication they'll be on. When in a lot of cases, if you actually analyse what is happening, the person may be non-verbal and be trying to tell you that they have a toothache, for example, or an ongoing headache. And because they're not able to verbalise that, they're becoming increasingly agitated that need is not being met, and therefore they exhibit what is sometimes interpreted as aggressive or challenging behaviour. So we've been, very vocal on trying to implement measures such as, if a person starts to get agitated, maybe instead of tying them to a chair, take them for a walk. Simple things like that actually challenge the way that these services are delivered, because I think a major part of the problem in this area is that often what is actually abuse is just seen as a regular part of the person's service delivery, because particularly in institutional settings, it's so rarely challenged because there are so few people around to do that. So that's a very brief rundown of some of the work we've been doing on a legislative level. There are also, ongoing individual constituent cases. My office has, at any one moment, up to at least 600 individual constituents that we are actively dealing with. There are 4 of us in the office as an independent and minor party member. Goodness me, I should probably get better at saying that since it's my job title. I am technically entitled to two full-time staff, a researcher and a personal assistant who deals with more of the administrative emails, phone calls and so on, and a trainee who does sort of the photocopying and that kind of day-to-day assistance. So it's a very small office to deal with 600 constituent files at any one time, but we certainly, I think, do a pretty good job. And advocating for things like better footpaths, working with mayors and city councillors and so on to improve access, physical sensory access in the city of Adelaide itself. But I think the interesting, one of the great things about my job is that, of course, at the end of the day, my job title is not disability rights advocate, it's member of parliament, and therefore I have a duty, an obligation to have a voice and a vote and an opinion on every single piece of legislation and issue that comes before my desk. Of course, it's great for me because I have views in and outside of disability, but it also, I think, helps to stop perpetuate the idea that people with disabilities are only willing or able to participate in life and in society on a disability-based level, as though my needs stop as long as I have a good wheelchair or things like that. So I think that's very helpful to the disability cause. And of course, disability knows no boundaries. People with disabilities are impacted by electricity prices just as much as, if not more, than other people. 50% of people with disability in Australia live at or below the poverty line. Only 50% of us are actively participating in the workforce, so that includes actively searching for work, so that doesn't even mean that 50% of us are employed. So of course things like rental prices, electricity prices, water prices hit us pretty hard. So it's great to have a voice in that respect as well. And I think one of the great things is that disability issues, as I said, disability knows no boundaries, and quite often a disability issue will pop up on a piece of legislation that you would think had nothing to do with disability rights. For example, the Parliament recently debated a bill on residential tenancies that deal with how much rent can you charge, where can people live, etc., etc. And one of the things that this bill sought to do was introduce a pet bond. So if a tenant was bringing a pet with them, the landlord or landlady had the right to charge a bond for any damage that pet may occur. And so I took the floor and I said, I hope the answer to this is a very obvious no, but it sounds to me like the way that this clause is written, the animals such as a guide dog or hearing assistance animal. And the minister responsible for the carriage of this piece of legislation stood up and said, well, yes, of course, they're a pet, they're an animal, therefore. And I said, no, not a pet, And to my mind, that's a very clear breach of the federal disability discrimination legislation that we. So those ongoing debates are important and encouraging. And I think a very encouraging thing as well is that over time, I'm noticing other members sort of start to realise that disability is everyone's business, particularly when it comes to policymakers, whether it's about the universal design in city planning or policies that impact people with disabilities unfairly. I'm seeing more and more members of Parliament actually stand up and say, well, what about this? And, for example, we discussed a piece of legislation recently that dealt with metal detectors and security and so on. And another member who happened to have no connection to disability other than his wife, the fact that his wife had recently had a cycling accident and was temporarily in a wheelchair, stood up and said, well, my wife now has a metal plate in her leg, and what if she went through the metal detector and it was activated, and would she then have to go through a full body search? And so I think that's been a very encouraging part of my work as well. So that's a very brief rundown of some of the work that we've been doing. I've also been asked to talk a little bit about my experience on the IVLP program here as well, and some of the things that I've learned. I'm conscious of time, so I'm, as a politician, I'm not very good at being pithy, but I'm really trying. Bear with me. It has been an amazing experience. I think some of the take-home messages thus far have been. I've really been impressed by the strength of your disability discrimination and accessibility legislation in terms of civil rights and how aware people seem to be of their rights and how often you see people actually taking city planners or individuals to court using your ADA. I think that's very impressive. And out of that, things like the Olmsted decision, keeping people out of nursing homes and institutional settings. I think we really have a long way to go in Australia in that regard. And I've also been very impressed by some of your committees. For example, in New York, I visited the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities and was very impressed at the level of respect and authority that particular office was given, even though they were allowed to use the Mayor's media department. That just wowed me. Not only were they actually letting people with disabilities in the media, they were allowing the Mayor's own department to be used for that. And of course, I'm being quite facetious. People with disabilities are allowed in the media in Australia, of course, but I don't know that we would allow our official department services to go to that. And to see the Mayor's Office negotiating with commissioners for housing and public transport and building accessibility is very encouraging, because we have something not dissimilar in South Australia called the Minister's Disability Advisory Council, but that works more on, I guess, a higher level policy level, so it doesn't really deal with things like real life accessibility of sidewalks and things like that, so that's been very encouraging. Other things that have really impressed me, of course there's been way too many to mention, but the level of volunteers. I visited an organisation this morning called Able Closet, which lends mobility and assistance equipment out to young children with disabilities so they can trial it and see what works for them. So it's all second-hand equipment that people outgrow or they don't use after a while, and so to actually see that being actively used is very encouraging, because under Australian law, governments are not technically allowed to pass second-hand equipment on to other Australian citizens, so all of ours mostly gets shipped very slowly overseas. So it's very encouraging to see. Of course, people need mobility aids overseas as well. I'm not going to, I'm not against that, but it's very encouraging to see that both is happening here. It's servicing both your citizens and people who need it abroad as well. I don't know how I'm doing for time, so I'm just going to do a check because
you're doing good.
I'm doing good? Okay. So it has been an incredibly encouraging experience for me to come and do a comparison of and take home some of those incredibly strong messages. And I'll be sure to schedule a meeting with our mayor as soon as I get home to discuss some of the things that I have done. I am still trying very hard to get our Lord Mayor to spend a day in a wheelchair, because I suggested that, why don't you come out with me and see what the accessibility is like? And he said to me, oh yeah, of course. I mean, obviously I couldn't do it on a day when I had any meetings or anything. And I said to him, how do you think I do my job? And he went, oh yeah, sorry. So every time he sees me, he's like, yep, we're on this, we're going to do this. But I never get the call, so I'm definitely going to be very keen to do that now that I've come back and seeing what things that we could be improving. Just some great examples of law and policy that's really positively impacting the lives of not only people with disabilities, but I think the whole of society, because especially when it comes to things like universal design and access to buildings and so on, that will impact all of us. I mean, all of us, and I don't want to take a morbid turn, but here we go. We're all temporarily abled, whether it's through accident or age or illness and so on. Your able-bodied privilege is always temporary, and that's always a difficult message to drive home, because I think a lot of people think it will never happen to me until it does. But I think, you know, it's really encouraging to see some cities taking universal design very seriously. I've also been asked, I'm sorry, I realise I'm jumping up and down a bit, but again, politician, just words fall out. Been asked to talk a little bit about my personal experience in terms of being a young woman in Parliament. It's interesting. At the time of my appointment to office, as I said, I was the youngest person ever elected to an Australian Parliament nationwide. I've since lost that and become the youngest female because there has been a young man elected at the federal level who's roughly a year younger than I am. I think, damn those kids. So I'm the youngest woman. It's certainly an interesting experience. I think one of the very first phone calls that my office received, it would have been in the first fortnight of my being in office, was this lovely elderly lady that called up my assistant, and she said, "Now, I love Kelly. Could you tell her I love her? I really admire her. I think she's great. But could she please wear longer dresses?" You know, and you know, it would still happen occasionally that we'll get the calls. "Why don't you dress like other politicians?" It's like, because I'm not a 50-year-old man. What do you want me to do? Like, there's not a lot I can do about that. But then on the other hand, if you know, on the occasions that I do, you know, maybe dress a little more, I guess what you might call conservative or suity or whatever, you'll get people that call up and say, "What's happened to you? What have they done to you?" So you can't, you really can't win that kind of argument. And it's interesting because obviously a lot of people have a certain perception of people in office to begin with, and I think in some ways that is multiplied or exacerbated by my age, because they're like, "Oh, you've been in office since you were 21, you don't know what it's like to live in the real world," and etc. And I find that such a strange argument, because I'm sure, you know, starving children in Ethiopia would say we don't know what it's like to live in the real world either, but it doesn't mean that we don't have real life experience and you know, opinions and you know, that matter, and that can make a difference to our particular situation. And at the end of the day, you know, my job in office is not to relate intimately to every single person that I deal with, because that is literally impossible. I can't be a man and a woman and young and elderly and, you know, have children and not have children. It's so, you know, I think that one of the key things from my position is empathy, and the ability to actually listen to people and appreciate that every individual has varying needs, and those needs can change at any one time. And so to always keep an open mind about people's needs and how variable they are, and to represent not only their needs but the greater good as best as I can with the information that I have available to me. So I think that's, you know, that to my mind is that the key thing for my position, as well as knowing what my limitations are, because at the end of the day I am technically the only dignity for disability member of parliament in the world, but you know, currently the only one in the country. I'm fortunate that with the upcoming state elections, state and federal elections, that might change, but knowing that you know, I can't personally provide a wheelchair or a guide dog or whatever it is that they need to every single person who calls my office, and I can't help people with their divorce. You know, it's, the number of issues that we get through the office is very varied, and unfortunately we're not always able to deal with it. So having the focus on the greater good, to use a very cliched term, is very important. Excuse me. So that's probably as brief a rundown I can give you of my particular experience. But certainly I think more broadly, speaking about women in office and in public life, we have a long way to go. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Australian politics. If you're not, you're probably incredibly fortunate at the present time. Australia in 2010 there was a leadership spill within government, and the then Prime Minister was evicted, I suppose, and replaced with Julia Gillard, who became Australia's first female Prime Minister. A few months ago, she was herself replaced with the person that she replaced. So it's been an interesting situation to watch. But what I found really fascinating in a very sad way was the way that she was treated as Australia's first female Prime Minister. She was asked questions both personally and publicly that I cannot imagine any male Prime Minister or member of office or anyone being asked. She was once asked on radio, live radio, if a male partner who is a hairdresser was gay and if they were still having intercourse. She was judged on her clothes, her hair. Of course, she had red hair, which didn't help her cause. We have a strange thing about redheads in Australia. So, her voice was annoying, apparently. And again, it was a no-win situation. She was photographed recently knitting a toy for the royal baby. That was just because we are a Commonwealth in Australia, so the royal family plays a larger part than I would like in our media and so on. And apparently she is quite an accomplished knitter. It's something that she actually does. But she was hounded. It was fake. It was contrived. It was put on. She didn't even have children, so what would she know? All of this kind of stuff that is just appalling. So, but my hope is that people like myself as young women in public life and people like Miss Gillard are going through it, I hope, so that future generations of women or people of ethnicity or disability or any kind of person with difference is not treated as appallingly as particularly Miss Gillard was. And certainly it's unfortunate that that person has to go through this, and it's certainly frustrating that we had to get a member of parliament appointed before our People's Parliament even became remotely accessible to people with wheelchairs, walking frames, prams and so on. But it is certainly pleasing that it is happening, at least very slowly. So that's a brief rundown on some of the work that I've been doing and the experiences that I have picked up on the way here. I'm very conscious of time, so I will finish there and open up to questions if there are any.
So Kelly, I wanted to ask you one question, I think, and everyone is really sharing with me. If you can maybe speak about what or who inspired you in what you do, because it's really incredible to watch you, how accomplished you are in such a young age.
Well, thank you so much.
And really positive and funny always.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't think there's such a thing as a universal mentor. I think I have different mentors for different areas of life, and different people I can discuss different things with, and I think that's really important. But if I had to pick one, source of inspiration, it would definitely be my mother. She is an incredible woman. She raised 3 children, 2 of them with disabilities. My brother has an intellectual disability and epilepsy. More or less single-handedly, she worked 2-3 jobs at a time in order to do that. And she, one of my fondest memories from childhood, of course it wasn't my fondest memory at the time, it was very embarrassing, but I look back at it and it's really one of my fondest memories was my mother would, every time she saw someone parking in an accessible car park without a permit, would immediately march up to them in her, not very flattering clothing of a weekend, and have a bit of a chat to them, and I'd say, "Oh God, Mum, why do you have to do that?" And she looked at me and she said, "One day you'll know exactly why." And I'm like, okay, I get it. So she was always very intolerant of any inequality, intolerance, injustice. Particularly, she was incredible with my education. She was determined that I was going to get a mainstream education, that I was going to be in a class with my classmates and participate as fully as possible in everything that they did. And in fact, when I was in primary school, the teacher organised an outing to the beach, and of course it's very difficult to push a wheelchair on the beach. So my teacher sat down with my mum and said, well, of course you understand why we won't be taking Kelly, and we'll give her extra work to do and she can stay in the classroom while the other kids go to the beach. Now I have to confess, I'm a little bit of a nerd, and when I say a little bit, I mean like a lot. So I was like, ooh, more work, like cool. and my mum was like, no. No, I don't understand that at all. And let me be very clear, Kelly goes, or no one does. And my mum is not an aggressive person. That was one of the few times in her life, I think, that she's ever made anyone cry. But apparently she did. And, you know, again, in high school, my school organised an exchange to Europe, which I really wanted to go on. I'm a devout lover of language and learned French and Spanish in school, and really wanted to go. But I went home and I said, you know, Mum, it's going to be kind of complicated for me to go, isn't it? So, you know, she said to me, and again, one of my fondest memories, she said, Kelly, when you were born, I put $1,000 away because I knew that you were going to have needs that other children didn't necessarily have, and that you were going to need, you know, extra. So, and you know, over time that's accumulated interest and become X amount. So if you like, you know, the money is there for you to go to Europe, and you know, that to me was just such an amazing to do that, especially knowing how hard she worked to put just the three of us through even just public school, you know. So, you know, she's always been my source of inspiration for never letting, you know, my disability or anything else for that matter getting in the way. But on the other hand, she's also my mum. Like, you know, when I was living at home, it was like, yeah, be as independent as you like, do whatever you want. And then as soon as I started talking about moving out, she's like, what if you fall over? Like, what if you get sick? What if you... And I'm like, when in the last 20 years have I fallen over? Like, she's like, oh no, you haven't, but what if you do? So, you know, she's also my mum, and my family are great, you know, for keeping me grounded as well. Like, you know, I think, you know, other, like my friends and stuff, they're always like, you know, how is work? And then I'll start talking about a really boring bill, and they'll be like, okay, shut up now. That's enough. That's really boring. And my brother will call me up and say like, oh, I saw you on TV. You look crap. You know? So they're really great at just keeping me grounded and focused. And yeah, I'm sorry that was a long-winded answer. But there's a lot to be said. Yeah, if you ever meet my mom, I think she's great. I don't know how you'll ever meet her, but if you do, yeah, I think you'll really enjoy her. She's a lot of fun.
Thank you, Kelly. So I want to open up if anybody has questions that you would like to ask Kelly. If you can maybe introduce yourself, that'd be wonderful.
I'm Paul Gietzel, and actually I have a brother-in-law. I'm Australian, you can probably tell from my accent.
Yeah, where are you from?
They're Queensland.
Ah.
I've never been to South Australia, sorry.
You're missing out.
Yeah. And I have a brother-in-law who's very severely disabled. Mm-hmm. And we were sort of discussing what it's like in different countries and how difficult it is to deal with just the day-to-day things in different countries. And you said you were traveling in Europe. I imagine it's much harder to get around in Europe, but I could be wrong. What's your experience?
It depends where in Europe. And you should also, you know, remember that when I went to France and Italy, for example, that was 6 years ago, as a 17-year-old. So access at that time was not great. I remember I went to school for a week in France, and the principal of the school was so proud because they had this new elevator that went up one floor, and there were like 5 floors to the school. But he was so proud that I could get in the elevator, go up the 1 floor, and then be carried the rest of the way. You know, I'm kind of like, yeah, that's great. That's really yeah, he was. But at that time, you know, there was an election going on, and there were members that were really interested in disability rights issues. So I'd be really interested to go back and see how it has developed. More recently, however, I have been to Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden on a study tour of disability access there, and they are miles ahead. These are cities that are 500, 600 years old, and yet they have recently legislated in Norway that all public buildings must be either built or redone using universal design principles by, I think, 2022, which is an enormously ambitious goal for such ancient cities. And also, I think, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that in Scandinavian countries, for whatever reason, political activism is rife. People are really very engaged, and that's certainly one thing that we lack in Australia. Unfortunately, we are generally quite a politically apathetic country. And so I think that has a lot to answer for. But, in Scandinavia, I was really interested, really kind of impressed by particularly their public transport. Like, not only could I get on the ramp, or they deploy the ramp for me, but they'd also then go and make sure that I was in the right spot, and they'd tie the wheelchair down, which, catching a bus back home, I'm kind of hanging on for dear life. So we have a long way to go, but I think, political engagement has a lot to answer for. Does that answer your question? Yep. Adequately? I'm sorry that I can't give you more details about the countries that I visited previously, but like I said, I haven't been there for almost a decade, so things could have changed rapidly and enormously.
Anybody else have a question?
My name is Phyllis, and I'm from here, and I am a survivor of a rare brain disease called an arterial venous malformation. And so I'm a member of the support group up at the hospital of people who deal with aneurysms and vascular malformations.
Sure.
And one of the big issues that we have is that everybody looks at us and says, "There's nothing wrong with you."
Yes.
It's that invisible problem. And because there's nothing wrong with you, nobody wants to deal with it, right? And so I wonder how you deal with it there.
It's certainly a big problem back home as well. Not only in terms of service provision, but on a societal level, I think the way that people with less visible disabilities get treated seems to be more, a lot more negative. And it's certainly much harder for those kinds of people to access services as well, because it's more difficult for them to prove their need. And also people with things like lupus disease or Crohn's disease can have, like everyone, good and bad days. And if they get assessed on a good day, they're probably not going to get the services that they require. So it's a big problem. And but I'm hopeful, because we are at something of a crossroads in Australia at the moment. Basically, the way that disability services funding occurs is about to change drastically from a state-based level to a nationalised system, broadly speaking. And one of the key selling points of that is that it will remove what we call the postcode lottery, or the acquisition lottery, which means where you live, but also how you acquired your disability, can dictate what services you require, even though you may have exactly the same needs as someone with a more visible disability. So it will be interesting to see how that pans out, but we're certainly very vocal, particularly about, we hear a lot about young children in the school system who may have an either diagnosed or undiagnosed learning disability, that where they might have exactly the same symptoms, or a lot of the same symptoms as someone with, say, dyslexia or autism even, but because they don't have that particular diagnosis, they're not eligible for services, which makes absolutely no sense. So we've been quite vocal on issues like that as well. And also one of the topics that I didn't touch on that I probably should have is we've been working very hard on people who, for example, may have a stroke, be perfectly able-bodied and then have a stroke, go to hospital, recover as fully as they can, but to go home they require maybe some additional services that they didn't before. And of course, because the Disability Services Department has to fund that extra support, they say, "Oh no, you could just stay at hospital," where the health department pays for that service. And we have had, for example, one constituent who was in hospital for 300 days. For 8 months of that time, she was declared fit for discharge. In the 300 days, so just under a year, she racked up, not her, but the government, purely on her hospital services, racked up a bill of $450,000, which could have built her a home to go back to. So, we're very vocal about the needs-based requirement for services, but also that there be easier transitions, and that people actually, the governments actually focus on outcomes for people, social and economic outcomes, rather than their own department's KPIs. Again, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Adequately? Excellent.
So to be conscious of time, I just would like to thank you so much, Kelly, for participating today and sharing your personal experiences.
Thank you.
I think maybe we could just move to really casual format with being recorded and continue our lunch. And if anybody would like to ask Kelly any